The world of Lady and the Tramp is, in many ways, Walt's world.
When Walt was doing Lady and the Tramp, Marceline was very much on his mind.
This was the world that Walt Disney grew up in.
The Disney family came to Marceline from Chicago, where Walt was born, and Elias wanted to get his family out of the city.
Marceline, Missouri must have been quite a strange environment for Walt when he first arrived there.
Coming from Chicago, from a big city, coming in on the railroad, getting on a horse and buggy and riding a few miles out into what must seem like the boondocks at the time, to live on a farm.
He just automatically fell in love with Marceline because of the mice and the rats and the stuff that he could see on the farm that he loved. And in fact, he had a tree that he called his dream tree.
It's this huge cottonwood tree that Walt found inspirational. As a child, he would go lie beneath its branches and he would listen to the sound tinkling in the leaves. He would observe all of nature around him, and that's where he first started to draw. Even as an adult, when Walt came back here for a trip, he would ask for time alone for inspiration underneath his dreaming tree.
He was a railroad buff, and of course Marceline was a railroad town at that time.
Walt's love for the railroad started right here in Marceline. Every time Walt came back to Marceline, he would come on a train. And if you look at the movie Lady and the Tramp, where was Tramp? Right there, by the railroad. When he came back in 1956 to dedicate the Walt Disney Swimming Pool and Park, he looked at the crowd that day at the Uptown Theater and he says, you know, you children are lucky to live in Marceline. My best memories are the years I spent here.
When you grow up and leave a place that meant something to you, and then when you come back, it just sort of all washes over you.
And I think when you look at a film like Lady and the Tramp, it captures some of that. It captures who Walt Disney is. Here's a guy in his mid-50s who has had a fantastic career making short cartoons and then became the talk of the town by making Snow White and the great movies of the golden age of animation. And now he's going back to something that perhaps we all do in the middle of our lives, which is kind of looking where we came from and looking what made us who we are.
In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus, the beginning of the civil rights movement. Lolita was a bestseller. There were nuclear warheads that were being tested in the country at that time. All of these social and political upheavals were going on, and yet Walt Disney presents his own nostalgic vision of what America can or should be.
Hello there, lady.
Who knows if Marceline, Missouri was as beautiful and as poetically conceived as the world of Lady and the Tramp. But he brought an extra level of artistry and color and some wistful sense of an America that really ceased to exist a long time ago.
When he was living there, it was the period when the high street was suddenly paved and cars began to come in and the world began to change. And Lady and the Tramp, in a sense, is about that world that's just about to change. You see just a few hints there. The telephones, there are hints of the automobile. It's still the old world, but it's not going to be that way much longer.
And I feel in Lady and the Tramp you get to see a little bit of that middle America, that idyllic place where the laundry on the line is a little bit brighter and the dappled light through the trees is a little bit more magical than maybe in real life. You certainly see it at Disneyland.
Now we want you to share with us our latest and greatest dream, Disneyland.
He opened Disneyland 1 month after premiering Lady and the Tramp, and it's kind of interesting. There's this cross-pollination. They both have a small-town feel to them, particularly the Main Street entrance to Disneyland, the whole prosperous but small-town setting for Lady and the Tramp.
It gave Walt a chance to show a little bit of himself, to say, I'm not off in Never Never Land, I'm not in Cinderella's castle, I'm in my own hometown. And I think that's why it's near and dear to audiences and has been ever since.
Right now, I want you to meet the stars of our latest dog picture. Lady and the Tramp.
For a movie based on dogs, about dogs, all from a dog's point of view, it's probably the most human story he's ever told.
It's a little bit like a soap opera, actually, you know. Boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl at the end.
And watching that unfold, it's hard to believe it actually took so long to actually get it up on the movie screen.
Now, Lady and the Tramp has really been a fun picture to make. It was an original story to start with, and as we made the picture and got to know the characters, we kept getting new ideas.
There's a lot of confusion about how Lady and the Tramp actually got to be made.
I honestly don't know much about the story.
I don't really know the historical record of the movie.
Well, you'll have to ask somebody who knows the picture real well.
It's especially difficult now to find out the truth because it was made so long ago.
What we really do know for sure is that the story of Lady and the Tramp started in the late 1930s with the legendary Joe Grant.
He was hired in 1933 originally as a caricaturist.
About that time they were making Three Little Pigs. When he saw Three Little Pigs first being animated, he thought, wow, this is a business I want to be in.
I think Walt sensed the great creativity because my father was also a writer as well as an artist.
His first real notice for a Disney audience would be The Witch in Snow White. He designed that hag.
Walt really trusted Joe Grant, and he was a great influence on many, many films at Disney.
He'd be the igniter of films, little ideas that would start entire features.
He and his wife had a Cocker Spaniel.
A Springer Spaniel?
A Cocker Spaniel.
Right?
A Springer Spaniel.
Springer Spaniel.
Cocker Spaniel named Lady.
Just to set the record straight, Joe's dog was a Springer Spaniel, white and brown all over. Lady is a Cocker Spaniel. She's honey-colored all over.
She was a beautiful, beautiful dog. But when I was born, Lady was shifted aside a bit.
Joe Grant did a single drawing of his dog, and he had Walt over for dinner one night. Walt was charmed by it. He just loved the way the Spaniel's coat was sort of like a little skirt on the dog.
And he said, Joe, why don't you do a storyboard on that?
And so that's how the story started.
He wove it into this charming story about Spaniel being sort of replaced by the baby's arrival.
The story didn't have Tramp in it. It had just the antics of a dog around the house getting the paper.
And then there's also a mean mother-in-law who comes in with a couple of cats. All of these elements were there in Joe Grant's story.
From the 1930s up to the early 1940s, countless Disney artists and story artists and writers worked on Joe's story of this dog, Lady. One version had Lady having two suitors. One was a Russian wolfhound named Boris, and the other one was a mongrel named Homer. Also, all the action took place inside of Lady's house, and the major conflict was about Lady and these two cats and an evil rat.
It wasn't until 1943 that Walt saw it for the first time in storyboard form.
Walt hated it. He just hated it, and really the problem was Lady herself.
Lady's a charmer. She is a lovely, lovely dog. And Walt knew that just charm and loveliness alone does not a story make.
That was it. They were stuck. They put the project on hold, back on the shelf, and a lot of animated projects die on the vine at exactly that stage.
That could have been the end of Lady and the Tramp, but luckily that wasn't the case.
One day, Walt read a story in Cosmopolitan magazine called Happy Dan, the Cynical Dog, and it was written by a man named Ward Green. Now, you have to understand, Cosmopolitan wasn't Cosmo then. It wasn't makeup tips and all that kind of stuff. It was a literary magazine, and it had about 2 million subscribers. The problem for the longest time was that Lady herself was too soft. So Walt thought if he took this cynical dog and brought him into contact with Lady, poof, fireworks.
Walt was a master at that, knowing when he's got something good, and knowing when he's got something great.
Unfortunately, World War II intervened, and the war years were very tough on the Disney studio.
And Walt really had to scale back in terms of animated filmmaking. He couldn't do the features anymore, they were too costly.
And it wasn't really until the 1950s, with Cinderella, that they got back on track again. The big difference with Lady and the Tramp is that it wasn't based, like many of Walt's best-loved films, on a fairy tale or a book that people already knew and loved.
I think as a filmmaker, it must have been so liberating for them to create great characters and tell a story that's not so bound by a fairy tale or by some source material.
One of the last decisions to be made was, what are we going to call this cynical dog? So there were various suggestions, Homer or Rags or even Bozo. So how about Lady and the Bozo? Yeah, that really, really has a good ring to it.
Walt decided at some point the male dog should be called Tramp. And there was a lot of discussion at the studio about, oh, I don't think we can call it that. That's kind of a, that has connotations of something else.
He's a tramp. He's a scoundrel.
But Walt went ahead with his own version, bullheaded, as always.
At this point, Joe Grant was no longer at the studio.
Joe Grant was top of the line in terms of people that Walt went to for ideas and trusted at the studio. But at one point they had a falling out.
Joe was a big story man on Alice in Wonderland. And one of the things that Walt said to me was, I didn't want to make Alice in Wonderland. Some of my staff talked me into it. It was Joe Grant who was one of the ones that talked him into it. So Joe leaves the studio in 1949.
And Daddy really missed it. And he said, well, life's changed.
One thing that still kind of nagged at Walt was that they were still making this story up completely from scratch. So he asked Ward Green to do a novelized version, which came out in 1953.
So at that point, it was really Ward Green's story that became the main source material for the film, and Joe Grant's earlier version was pretty much ignored.
They sort of cut Joe's contribution out of it. I don't think he even gets credit in the film itself.
The one that didn't like it the most was my mother. She was very Irish and very upset, because that was our story.
As if all this weren't enough, they put it about that Walt actually gave his wife a puppy in a hat box. So it's a kind of thing where that then became the official spark that generated the movie Lady and the Tramp.
I've heard this, and I know Joe goes,
Whether Walt gave Lily the puppy in the hat box or didn't give Lily the puppy in the hat box, he knew that the story was a good one to fit with the creation of Lady and the Tramp.
The final film is charming, wonderful, and evocative of a simpler time in America's history. But that simpler time really is just a background for what I think is one of Walt's most complex and adult films.
It's a love story about two different kinds of people from two different worlds.
Well, that's what comes of tying yourself down to one family.
After Tramp shows Lady the town and all the exciting things that she doesn't know about, they sort of settle in for the night, and the camera dissolves, and then the camera comes up again, and it's morning. And you kind of wonder what happened there. You know, it's a little risque. Maybe too many people don't think about that, but most likely, you know, they had a romantic night.
That was probably one of the toughest things they had to figure out. How can we get away with this? Lady's going to give birth to pups at the end of this movie, but how do we breach that subject? Well, they really do it cleverly, with Jock and Trusty coming over the next day.
But I've never even considered matrimony.
It all gets into this very adult subtext, certainly in live action that had been dealt with many, many times, but to bring that into a sort of Disney animated children's movie, obviously they walked a fine line there, and I think they walked that line beautifully.
And when I heard they'd taken you to the pound...
Oh, don't even mention that horrible place.
I love animated features that will go to the hard truth.
Hey, you guys, look. Poor Nutsy is taking the long walk.
Dogs go down. Hard truth.
I think the only way that they could take sort of the edge of the idea of that scene is by showing it in shadow.
The danger is there, the death is there, but it's deflected and it's not direct.
Where is he taking him?
Through the one-way door, sister.
That dog goes down because later Tramp's going to be heading there by the same guys, hauling him right to that same gate.
So you know when Tramp is being caught by the dog catcher, he's in serious danger.
By the time you reach the end of the story, when Trusty and Jock are in pursuit, it starts moving so fast that you're almost shocked when you get to the end.
I thought as a kid that he was dead. I mean, I was really bawling because I thought, well, he's not going to live. You know, of course not. Look at this. He's dead.
Originally, Trusty was supposed to die. And Mother just was devastated, and she said it will upset the children much too much. And she sort of fought for it.
Careful now, man.
I think the audience could have handled that dog dying. In fact, it would have added a little more weight and a little more love for Trusty in the long run.
Oh, no doubt about it. They've got their mother's eyes.
Joe Grant, we said, what's the take home? What is the audience going to talk about in the car on the way home?
You had such rich characters that you loved. And that's what you took home with you.
It wasn't until his wife passed away in the mid-'80s that Joe joined the studio again and contributed amazing ideas to films like Lion King and Pocahontas.
Things like the leaves swirling around Pocahontas.
My mother said, Carol, how would you like to get up every day of your life and do the thing you love most all day long? And that's my father.
I don't think Joe ever felt he was going to pass away or die, and I don't think any of us ever felt he would.
In 2005, Joe Grant did pass away at the age of 97.
The film came out almost 50 years ago, and Joe thought about the idea even earlier. So it's nice that now, after all this time, people know that it was Joe who really came up with the idea.
Now, we've had a lot of requests from people who want to know how we put our pictures together. So for this part of the program, I want to give you an idea of how we went about making Lady and the Tramp.
Lady and the Tramp had the animation crew at a point where, I don't want to say at their peak because they did fantastic things afterwards, but their work had gotten so refined by the mid-50s, they could really animate anything beautifully, anything.
Oh.
I love the animation in this film because it's so observed. Looking at dogs, the way they're rolling around and laying, you know, everyone who has dogs knows those poses. That's what dogs do.
In the 50s, there was a group of animators that Walt considered his key animators, and he called them the 9 Old Men.
The 9 Old Men really became the key players who continued on for decades, really, and shaped the Disney style and helped Walt telling his stories and really animated all of the films.
Those were the guys that were there and did it, and so they deserved the credit that they got, and they were all unique.
You see completely different drawing styles, because people might think that, oh, everybody at Disney would have to draw the same, because it looks so even in the final film, but they didn't draw the same.
Animation is really the best when it's when you concentrate on the details and how a character does something, and you create a character. That's when we're at our best.
One of the things my dad and other animators do is they just observe life and see how things go, and that's why the animation is so realistic.
And being a dog picture, we naturally looked at a lot of dogs, and they were a mighty appealing bunch.
Certainly they studied dogs a lot in the movie, and they captured the movement of dogs just perfectly.
You do have to do a lot of studying to learn how they walk, what leg do they put down before the other one, how do their shoulders work.
It needs to be clear which leg the weight is on. And what you do as an animator, you push the shoulder up. It's always interesting to see how Walt paired the animator for a certain character. Walt loved to pair Frank Thomas with Milt Kahl.
Let's look in on Milt Kahl, who's been teaming up with Frank Thomas on Lady and the Tramp right from the start of the picture.
Milt was, of course, known for his incredible draftsmanship.
Milt Kahl was primarily responsible for the animation of Tramp. He brings a lot of macho qualities to Tramp, devil-may-care qualities that Milt Kahl had himself.
Well, first we thought of the Tramp with one black eye. Thought he'd be kind of cute. Sort of a tough little guy from across the tracks.
One of his masterpieces in the movie is when we see Tramp for the first time.
There's a scene where he kind of wakes in the morning, he stretches, and the stretch is so extreme. You feel tension and the bones popping.
There's a section where he's imitating the humans, and he changes from a realistically drawn dog into this wonderful caricature that's part dog, part human.
Stop that racket, you'll wake the baby.
It just is a magical sequence there, the way he exaggerates the animation and pulls it back. Great control, but yet great letting go.
Animators are performers or actors with a pencil. You know, even though there's a lot of drawing involved, but the drawing is secondary. It's not as important as the performance, as the movement and the feeling that you have to have.
There probably never has been an artist who is more naturally suited to putting emotion into animation than Frank Thomas was.
This is Frank Thomas, one of our key animators.
If you look back on the scenes that Frank did, not everybody would have done them with the wonderful acting ability and life.
And very, very soft. Frank came up with those scenes where Tramp is introduced to the other dogs.
Jock is trying to make him shoo away, get this riffraff to go away. And there's this attitude and feistiness to him.
And we've no need for mongrels and radical ideas. Off with you, new! Off with you! Off with you!
Okay. You know, you have to think about, well, what am I going to have this dog do to, in a dog way, say, get out of here, blow it off, you know? And I think it's a great example of Frank finding just the right timing and nuance in a performance. All right, let's see what we got. This is right about, well, so Lady and the Tramp was in production when this was going on.
Right, and Frank was observing every dog in the neighborhood.
Do you remember how long Dad was working on Lady and the Tramp?
Oh, dear. 3 years?
Something that Frank in particular was so strong on was taking everything he saw around him. That's a good slow motion study on
the dog. That's probably why he did it.
And somehow taking the essence of that gesture, or the essence of that feeling, and putting it into whatever character he was working on. So you were operating the camera on this.
I must have.
And because he was animating dogs, he got to wash the dog. But I noticed that when it comes to dry the dog, that's your job.
Frank always thought he wasn't a good draftsman. He really said, I just don't draw that well. But his search was there, and the analysis that he put into it created beautiful drawings. Ollie Johnston is the opposite. He gets himself almost into a state of mind where he feels very deeply what the character is going through, and then that would tell him how to animate the character.
Ollie had a very delicate light touch in his drawings. Some of these lines just almost disappear, very just kind of feathering the paper with the pencil. Very different from Frank, who would just sculpt and carve it into the paper.
Ollie Johnston is really the last of Walt's 9 old men, so I take time out whenever I can to see Ollie and talk to him.
Ollie pretty much focused on Lady and going through her frustrations when the baby arrives, you know, and she talks to the other dogs about it. And that's very insightful animation because you really have to read the inner feelings of the character.
He's never called me that before.
Well, now, lassie, I wouldn't have worried my wee head about that.
Walt depended on Wooly Reitherman to do the fight sequences or the action sequences because he was really good at staging them.
We could get a good dramatic effect here by having part of the fight behind the barrels. And have shadows of the dogs cast on the wall.
I was probably between 3, 4, 5 years old, and not being in school, I used to hang out with my dad a lot So one day, my dad and a few of the other animators were going over this scene of the alley fight in Lady and the Tramp. And I remember they got one of these gooseneck lamps to kind of create a shadow on the wall, and then the guys got on the floor and started tussling, and kind of, you know, one or two would watch the other two guys and trying to see how the shadows went on the wall, and they were just trying to get all the kinds of antics they could do to make something a fight, but not a cruel fight, but kind of a schoolyard kind of fight.
What if he bit the big curl in the leg like this? Starts down here at the bottom and works his way right up the top.
Wooly was so good at creating those really powerful, iconic visual images on screen.
I know that my dad often approached these scenes from the point of view of the thing he knew was going to lose the fight, and then try to not make that happen. You just can't help but be a little squirm when you watch these things, because you really don't know how they're going to turn out.
To see that lightning flashing and that rat is looking down and about ready to jump on that baby, it's like, that's as horrifying an image as you can possibly get on screen.
All right, you guys. Lay off, will you?
What's the matter, Peg?
Oh, can't you see the poor kid's scared enough already?
Eric Larson, I think did probably some of his best work on this movie. He did Peg, and I found this very fun photograph that was taken during the making of Lady and the Tramp in the 50s. And here we have this big superstar, Peggy Lee, visiting Eric. And you can just see how bashful he is, showing her his work, you know, and he's maybe even a little bit smitten by her. I think it's all in here.
He was a Mormon, and he said he always got chided for how he was able to animate this very sexy little gal doing this song.
Gives you plenty of
When Eric Larson told the story of animating He's a Tramp, he would explain that it was the happiest experience that he ever had as an animator.
He's hanging out with Peggy Lee on this movie and doing a sexy performance of this pooch, and I think, wow, an animator can do anything.
Now here you are, the best spaghetti in a town.
Storytelling, often, we know where it's headed in a way, don't we? But the trick of it is to pay it off in a unique way. In a love story, we know that people are going to fall in love, but how do they fall in love?
Oh, this is the night, it's a beautiful night.
I think the spaghetti sequence is a great example of great acting, because what that sequence is all about really is not two dogs eating spaghetti. It's about two dogs falling in love.
And a romantic section with subtle acting needs to be handled very carefully. So the drawing has to be right on the money. I don't know that anybody else could have pulled this off like Frank Thomas did. I mean, he was the guy.
When it was on storyboards and Walt saw it, Walt didn't like it, or at least he didn't think it would work.
I imagine that when he thought of dogs eating spaghetti, you know, it's going to flop up, and what's romantic about that? It's silly. It's ridiculous.
So Frank took it on his own. He worked out the basic animation and it actually showed it to Walt to sell him on it.
He had that in his head. He just had to actually do it before other people could see it that way.
Aren't we grateful that Frank actually persisted, right? That he didn't listen to Walt. He said, no, I'm going to make this work, and I'll show him that it's going to be entertaining.
You'll find an enchantment here. The night will weave its magic spell.
So, Ollie, when you look back over movies like Lady and the Tramp and some of the others, do you feel a sense of pride?
Oh, sure.
That you've accomplished something really important?
Yeah.
People like me can only be grateful because all this inspires us to keep going, you know. So for all that, I want to thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
You have seen how we make the cartoons move and talk. Now, like all actors, they must have backgrounds to work with.
This was the first CinemaScope widescreen animated movie.
CinemaScope was a totally new format, and yet here they were using it for very traditional subject matter.
What you see in Lady and the Tramp is a beautifully detailed, real Victorian world.
It's almost like an animated Norman Rockwell painting. It has that detail and this Americana styling to it.
It's a dreamlike landscape. And I think it's something you can only do with a paintbrush and some really, really brilliant artists.
The mid-50s were an interesting time because TV had just come in, which was the new medium that was supposed to kill movies.
A lot of theater owners were wondering, how are we going to compete? Movies are going to go away, and everybody's going to just watch films in their living room. So what's special? And that's when you got things like Cinerama, like big wraparound screens, and you also got CinemaScope, which was a widescreen but could be shown in virtually any theater with a change of a lens.
CinemaScope set up a new set of demands for the backgrounds. They had to be interesting all the way across.
When you look at the backgrounds, they create pools of light and softness where the action's going to play. And that's a discipline, because every artist that I know wants to have their work coming forward.
Of all the Disney background artists, Claude Coates was a master at creating detail without distracting you. You're always looking at the character.
It's hard to describe all the things that go into making a great background artist like Claude was, because you're both the lighting designer, you're the scenic designer, and in some ways you're the cinematographer. And I think Claude was a master at doing all of those things.
I love how haunting this feels. There's just a definite sort of scary mood in this, the way these buildings are angled. It's all a little bit off and not real, but it just adds to a certain mood.
Most animated films, before they even have a script, have an idea that needs to be conceptualized. And there are inspirational sketch artists who do that. And one of the greatest was Mary Blair.
Mary Blair was a fascinating artist because she had her own way of suggesting little vignettes of stage characters.
There are wonderful watercolor paintings by Mary Blair that depict Lady in certain situations that were from the original treatment. These are some early watercolors. Here's Lady out in a snowstorm, being lost. And here she is, being found not by humans, but by dogs, as she's almost frozen to death out here. Well, Mary Blair had left the studio in '53, so the design of a Lady had other people working at it, and one of them was Ivan Earle.
Ivan Earle's best work, best known work, is his design work for Sleeping Beauty, a very, very stylized design for the entire film. But he was also a key contributor on Lady and the Tramp.
Ivan Earle did the sequence of Bella Notte. He painted about 50 little tiny, maybe 1.5 by 2 inch long, little panels of studies of different ideas for that scene.
You can see his encrusted trees and the shadows and the very limited palette that he uses, very simple shapes that read very well from across the room.
Well, he painted the great background where they're at the top of the hill in the park. Walt said, I want you to paint the town in such a way that staying in town looks great. The town is wonderful. And leaving the town on an adventure looks great.
Well, they put the whole movie at a low angle, so you're seeing it from the dog's point of view.
When you're down that low, it's a very horizontal world. The world is not defined by the sky. It's defined by the floor and the carpet and the lawn and the fire hydrant and all this stuff down there.
Claude Coates was trained in architecture, so I think he was particularly good at giving credibility to the environments.
Dad liked to build models so he could see dimensionally how things were going to translate to what he was doing in 2-dimension in the background.
Well, he told me that the only way that he could really get what it would be like from a dog's view was to move a camera into the model and look up at these tables and everything from a dog's view.
Like this one is from the viewpoint of Lady, looking up, so you see the bottom of everything.
If you look very closely at the models, you can see Jim, Dear, and Darling, and the dogs as cutouts.
Now you would build those models in a computer and you'd fly the camera around. Well, they were doing exactly the same thing.
Lady and the Tramp started out as being full screen, but the popularity of CinemaScope had taken place, and Walt said, hey, we got to make this in CinemaScope. So he had us go back and elongate everything out on either side, and they would paste on this new stuff and then mask it with maybe an overlay of a tree where it was together, you know. So there was tricks going on constantly to do this.
To be able to use that full aperture in a meaningful way, it was quite a trick.
Sometimes in the movie you feel like they've set up certain shots of the film in a very stationary kind of small way, and then they just simply added east and west onto the field, and it seems kind of lonely out there.
They had to put action out there. So when dogs were fighting with each other and they were in close, they spread them apart.
Where typically the camera might move more, in CinemaScope you can just let the camera sit and let the actors, in this case dogs, move around, move back and forth, deliver their dialogue, and just enjoy the scene a little bit more.
Homewreckers, that's what they are.
Look here, laddie. Who are you to barge in?
The voice of experience, Buster.
One problem that Disney faced was that not all theaters were equipped to project CinemaScope.
It may have been Brother Roy who had the checkbook there in hand. He said, Walt, we're going to have to, in a way it's going to cost more money, but you're going to have to do two versions.
So he had to produce a separate flat screen version, which again involved the layout men and replanning the action of the film.
So they actually animated two versions of it, one for the regular format picture, and one with the extra characters on the side for the widescreen.
You get the urge for a nice, comfortable...
So I think that's why when they say, gee, we saw a different version of Lady and the Tramp, it didn't have that beautiful wide scene of all those houses. What happened to that? Well, it was the regular, smaller version.
We've got a look in Lady and the Tramp that's very unique, very believable, and very realistic, and still at the same time delivers that Disney magic.
Lady and the Tramp is certainly a film that's nostalgic for a bygone era in America's past. And maybe one of the reasons it feels that way is because Walt himself was nostalgic for that bygone era.
There were tough times here in Marceline for so many people on the farm.
Elias got sick and lost the farm, and they had an auction. And Roy and Walt had to pound in the telephone poles the announcement of the auction. And that was Paradise Lost.
There was this huge sense of community among the people who lived here.
He loved everything about Marceline, and he hated having to leave Marceline.
It was that sense of community, I think, that also followed Walt throughout his life.
Over the years, it became clear that the relatively short period of time that Walt spent in Marceline really stayed with him.
Walt saw that you didn't have to have a lot in your life, but you could give a lot in your life.
Today in Marceline, there's a reconstructed barn on the farm where Walt lived. If you go inside the barn, you can see written over all of the walls, thank you messages to Walt for all the great things that he brought us.
Dear Walt, seeing you on Sunday night meant so much to my family. Dear Walt, thank you for keeping Marceline so special. Dear Walt, you were a magic part of my childhood.
That's very important for younger generations because they can see somebody that influential the entire world over who grew up in small town America and was able to take something from there and make it into something that the world wanted.